We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health, Wednesdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Hi everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Will Hall. Today we have Evelyn Pringle, who is a prolific journalist, writes on pharmaceutical company corruption, and she often writes for op-ed news, but her work is published widely on the internet. And she's going to be talking to us about the Zyprexa scandal and what's going on with pill company corruption. So let's go to that interview. So Evelyn, thank you very much for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Yes, nice to be here.
And like I was saying, I really, your writing and your investigative work and your journalism is just really fantastic. And so it's great to have you on the show today. And I really encourage people to read your work. And where can they do that? Is op-ed news the best place to pick up your latest writing?
You know, op-ed news is, but I tell readers, if they want to see my writing on a particular drug or a particular drug company, just type my name in quotes and the drug in quotes in a Google search, and it'll turn up all my articles on that.
That makes sense, and I'll also
they're all over.
I'll be linking as well on the radio website to you and your articles. So why don't we start off, because I know you followed the Zyprexa, the Eli Lilly Zyprexa scandal with the leaked documents pretty closely, and there have been a lot of developments with Congressman Waxman doing some hearings on Capitol Hill, and there's been a lot of developments. So maybe you can just bring us up to speed of what's going on with the Zyprexa scandal as of today.
As of today, I would say that what you just said is probably what's going on today. I know that Waxman and some other congressmen asked them for the documents that were, well, they say leaked to the press. I think they were given to the press for good reason, because they knew that they were going to be remained buried under court order for who knows how much longer, and all the public was not going to know about the dangers of Zyprexa or what was going on, that they're being prescribed this drug for uses that aren't approved by the FDA. But anyhow, the documents, I don't know how much your listeners know, but the documents were ordered back to the court in the end. But the judge said that he couldn't put an injunction on the world, so that loosened up the rest of us journalists to be able to write about it again. But the major media doesn't cover this story. I think anybody that tried to follow it would see that. I was able to cover it because my work's usually published in internet dailies. So, and they don't interfere with my content, my articles. They take my writing as it is. So the only way that I could write about the Zyprexa case was to not mention anything else than was already quoted in the New York Times, because otherwise I would have been put under that injunction and I wouldn't have been able to write. So what I did was just I had the documents, but I didn't quote any, but I just kept up on the legal, what was going on in the legal courtroom in the battle, and then I just conveyed to readers what was going on behind the scenes, and of course that was legal because, you know, there's an open court. But as far as being able to quote the documents anymore that was in them, I had to wait, whatever it was, the month or two before the judge finally said that he couldn't put an injunction on the world to print anything more out of those documents. And I think right after the day that the order came out, I think I published an article, something like more Zyprexa postcards from the edge, and started quoting them. And I got responses from my readers, you know, why are you doing this? They're gonna, you know, you're gonna get in so much trouble. And I said, no, the court order's out that they can't restrain the world, you know. But the scary part is that Lilly was able to do that, to use its power in the courts to shut down every major journalist or medical expert that has written articles or books or anything on Zyprexa. So basically they're a hit list of people that have spoken out on this drug, and they were able to tie them up in court for months while this story should have been out in the media and being discussed. And then on top of that, journalists like me couldn't contact these experts or other journalists or reporters that always report on these stories because they weren't allowed to discuss anything in the documents.
Yeah, it was a
So
real
the chilling effect.
yeah, it was a real chilling effect, and I mean, I was under the court order injunction for several months, and
Right.
then it was finally lifted on me and a number of other people. But I guess there are still several of the people who are still under court injunction. Is that right?
That's right. I
And,
mean, I've contacted Jim Gottstein, and I've tried. I don't really know Dr. Eagleman, but to try to find out whether there was what was going on, if Eli Lilly was still pursuing contempt charges or, doing anything to them, and they won't talk about it. And that's sad. I mean, because I think people are interested. I mean, Lilly was making itself clear that that's what it intended to do. But I think the big point here, too, was that Lilly knew better than to go after the New York Times. That was the only person that quoted the documents to that date when they went after that injunction, but they didn't try to get an injunction on the New York Times or Alex Bernstein. And that really aggravated journalists like myself because it was like, well, because the New York Times can fight you and this won't work. You're not including them, and they're the ones that, are credited with leaking the documents to begin with. And then that the judge made the statement in court that he's not going to put an injunction on the New York Times, but he put an injunction on you and all those other journalists, and I would have been put on it if I, let a peep out of them documents. I think that was totally unfair, and I don't know how you felt,
yeah,
but I was really outraged
it
over
was
that.
it was of course totally unfair, and it was just a basically a blatant attempt to silence and create a chilling effect and to get the information kind of back under secrecy. And maybe you can just give us a summary. What is it that's in the documents? These are the leaked Eli Lilly memos that were brought out to light about the dangers of Zyprexa. What's in them that the mainstream media hasn't really talked about or addressed or acknowledged?
Well, it's so funny because I said in one of my articles, Lily's acting all indignant like this is new news. It is not new news. Most of us, well, somebody like me that has been investigating Zyprexa for over 3 years, knew all of this. It's just that the media never put it out there. Or maybe there was a little deep here and there that it caused, that Zyprexa could lead to excessive weight gain and cause diabetes and stuff, but they never put it out there where people should be reading it like a headline. I mean, because Zyprexa became Eli Lilly's number one selling drug. Now, this was a drug that was approved, first of all, for the first 4 years, only to treat adults with schizophrenia. In 2002, it was approved to treat adults with the manic phase of bipolar disorder. So how in the world would this drug go on to be the number one selling drug of Eli Lilly if it wasn't pushing it for other uses? And so by the time the dangers came out, that drastic weight gain that leads to diabetes and the abnormal blood sugar levels and cardiac problems, all these people, millions and millions of people were on this drug already. Well, when the leaked documents came out, it sounded like it was new news to a lot of people to find out that Lilly knew this. I think it was as far back as 1996 from its own studies, and didn't make it known and didn't tell the FDA. And I think the warning went on about diabetes like in 2003 or something like that. And by that time, I think there were lawsuits mounting. But it wasn't really new news. It was the media's fault for never following through on it. And if you follow up on the articles on the Zyprexa document scandal, you'll see hardly no major outlets covered that story. So, I mean, they really made the issue more public from journalists like me by going into that court routine and making that big circus, putting an injunction on people like you and Jim Gottstein and all the rest of the experts on psychiatric drugs,
So in a
because it was
sense,
so obvious to somebody like me.
so in a sense, we weren't even really the targets of this, that it was a message that was being
No,
sent to the larger journalistic community that, look, don't mess with Eli Lilly. I mean, they're very, very smart. I mean, one of the things that also has happened is that, Jim Gottstein has been very worried that there would be some kind of criminal indictment against him,
right?
and which could potentially destroy his entire career and end all of his finances and get him disbarred from the legal practice, and he would have nothing. And Lilly hasn't done that, and we're thinking that maybe I mean, maybe you can say what you think about this as well, but that they haven't really done that because ultimately that would be kind of it wouldn't be in their best interest. It would backfire against them because then it would become another issue and they would be back in the news, and the entire psychiatric survivor movement and everybody who's really concerned about this issue would be fighting about it, and it would be just a big issue and public relations nightmare for them. So they really have backed off from that. Is that your sense of it as well?
Well, I've tried to find out if they've really backed out from that, because I haven't found any evidence that they really have. And so, like I said, when I sent an email to Jim Gottstein, I was inquiring about that. Did they back out from that? Was he out from under any threat? And was Dr. Eaglestein out? But he wouldn't respond to that.
Well, I know from talking with Jim, I know he's under threat, but they haven't actually filed an indictment or anything like that.
That's pretty much good enough, don't you think?
Yeah, I think
hang over somebody's head.
That's right. That's exactly right. So they're very clever. They've been doing. They did exactly the same thing with Prozac. I mean, people have to remember that this routine that they've got, which is basically put a dangerous drug out, push it illegally, make a ton of money on it, have a lot of people sue them, and then buy them off with out-of-court settlements that include gag orders that tell people that the information isn't going to be released to the public. It's exactly what they did with Prozac, and they've done the same thing with Zyprexa. There's more than $1 billion in settlements around the dangers of Zyprexa, and yet the drug is still on the market.
And it's still just about Lilly's bestseller, if it's not still the bestseller. And their second best-selling line of drugs are diabetes drugs. So that's really sick.
Yeah, so they're selling the drugs that are causing the disease that they're selling the other drugs for.
Right.
So.
And another thing that I put out that was in the Zyprexa documents when I put out the article the day the order came out was that that they had this plan for when the warning was going to come out from the FDA and the American Diabetes Association, that warning the public and doctors about Zyprexa is dangerous for diabetes and everything. Well, the plan was to indemnify doctors. Tell doctors, go ahead and keep prescribing it, because if you get sued for it, we'll cover you. Okay? And in the same memo, and this is what I wasn't allowed to publish while everybody was with the threat of the gag order, that in the same memo, they talk about giving NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness, the biggest pharma front group in the U.S., millions of dollars to start a nationwide campaign to downplay the risk and basically tell people that, diabetes is common among schizophrenics anyhow. It's not the drug. And in the one when they were discussing indemnifying the doctors, that's what they said, that it worked well when they did it with Prozac. Now that is sick. There was nothing in that memo saying, we better warn these people now. We knew that there's documents here that showed they knew it before. They knew it when it went on the market. But there was nothing in there saying, gee, I think we better warn the public, hey, now that we really, really know it. Not a word. It was all about damage control and keeping them doctors prescribing that drug.
And
it was successful.
And so where in this picture is the FDA? I mean, why isn't that there's no enforcement or actual oversight of the pharmaceutical industry?
Because the FDA, the Bush-appointed FDA is all the top officials are industry insiders. Okay, what they're doing and the public doesn't even know. In these suits, like say that you were talking about that settled out of court, in there for $1.some billion to settle with 28,000 people for the last 10 years, Lilly gets them to not say anything anymore about what Zyprexa did to them or their loved ones, or make the allegation that it was prescribed off-label for everything under the sun by every kind of doctor under the sun. And in there, they also have to say that they won't sue the doctor that prescribed them that Zyprexa. Okay, but it's secret documents, so the public don't get to know this, but I know this. And so the FDA now has this plan where it issued this thing where it says if they approve the drug and they didn't say that a warning needs to be on that label, the citizens in state courts can't sue that drug company and say that they failed to warn. Say like now about Zyprexa, that they failed to warn, even though they knew it, even if you can produce evidence that showed that they knew it, and produce evidence that showed that they didn't give that information to the FDA. Bush's FDA files briefs in these cases and tells the judges to dismiss the cases because this preemption rule applies from the FDA, and being they approve the drug and the label, nobody can sue it for failing to warn.
And
Now, this is...
Why is it that the FDA gets away with this? I mean, why is it that is it essentially the influence of money on politics in Washington? Was there something that happened? I know that there was a law change, and the funding of the FDA is actually partly from the pharmaceutical industry now. So in your sense of things, what is the real mechanism that's going on here? Is it the unrestricted lobbying that happens from this pharmaceutical industry?
It's just bought and paid for. I mean, Bush would not be in that White House. I mean, he stole the elections, but he wouldn't be there anyhow. But he really wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the pharmaceutical industry. You know, and if you track, and I have written articles about the people that he brought into his administration from the pharmaceutical industry and the ones that leave that go directly to the pharmaceutical industry. One that I noticed, one that I've been writing about lately, used to head the entire Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, and he was the director over the FDA. Eli Lilly just hired him in May. And in their press release, they even say that for these years in the Bush administration, he directed the FDA. Okay, Bush brought in the attorney for the FDA that was straight out of the pharmaceutical industry, representing pharmaceutical companies against the FDA. For instance, representing them to pass looser laws against prescribing drugs off-label on the grounds of free speech, that pharmaceutical companies should be able to do that. He was one for fighting for direct advertising to consumers. Well, then Bush got elected. He brought that attorney in as chief counsel of the FDA. Then he went to town filing these briefs against us private citizens that were damaged by drugs in state courts to say that we couldn't sue them, any of these drug companies. And this is so complicated that I would tell readers to go read those articles, because I don't think the American people have any idea that they're pulling this. And I mean, even with a drug like Vioxx and Zyprexa, a Texas judge just dismissed a whole bunch of suits against Vioxx before they could ever get to court, saying that the FDA had approved Vioxx and the labeling, so they couldn't sue them for failing to warn.
And I know you've also done some research on the whole question of, antidepressants and suicide, and antidepressants and violence, and even the possible role of antidepressants in some of the mass murders that have happened. Can you tell us what the research says about that and how the pharmaceutical industry is trying to cover that up?
Well, the latest one, and I'll answer your questions. I just want to briefly touch on the latest stunt they pulled. These SSRIs, the first one came on the market in 1987, these antidepressants, and that was Prozac. And through the 90s, there was, I don't know how many suits settled out of court, but without the public ever knowing it. Well, while they sat there and said they didn't cause suicide or weren't linked to violence, but they were quietly settling these cases out of court, and the media didn't cover it or whatever. Nobody heard about them, okay? So now, in the last few years, they've really been found to cause birth defects in babies, and I mean serious ones, life-threatening lung disorders, holes in the heart defects. I mean, serious ones besides withdrawal in babies and a bunch of other problems. But anyhow, now they just put out a new study, and it was published by all major news media, and it was on all the major talk shows, that the risk of birth defects is really low. I mean, some of the headlines said they weren't at all. And I was just outraged. I mean, the longer these drugs are on the market, the worse things are coming out about them. And like you said, just about every school shooter in the last whatever has been on these drugs. Okay? And I'll tell you the difference that caught my eye with this. It was like I went to Washington, D.C. to cover a protest about people that had lost loved ones to suicide or violence, were sitting in prison, their loved ones, because they took these drugs. And I talked to a bunch of people. And by the end of the time I was there, what stood out in my mind was the violence in these suicides. It was like unheard of, and especially for women. Women, I mean, you're probably too young to know this, but women always were known to just do pills or something. Don't do nothing to make yourself not look good in the coffin. Don't do that. Well, these are people that one girl, 17-year-old girl, threw herself down below a subway with all kinds of people around. Another girl stabbed herself to death in the heart in the kitchen of her home with her mother in the next bedroom. Another girl tried to hang herself from a ceiling fan, and when that didn't work, she set herself on fire. There was a little 11-year-old girl in the school bathroom at school, hung herself with her shoelaces tied together. Another kid that, in order to commit suicide, he had to hang, he had to keep his feet up off the ground because he was too tall.
So these are very violent kinds of deaths,
bizarre.
and that's
You
linked
never
to
hear
that's
this.
consistent with what the studies are saying about the agitation and the akathisia and the way in which the drugs can cause violence and cause suicidality. You mentioned something about the birth defects linked to SSRI's study coming out, and then later new studies came out that said, well, actually, there's not a link with birth defects. So basically, you're saying that there are these sham studies out there. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they mentioned most of the news media. Like I said, I didn't get to it right at the time because I was in the middle of some other stuff I had to do, but I kept hearing it. So, and I knew it wasn't true, but I didn't know where it was coming from. So what they did was publish 2 articles, 2 studies in the New England Journal of Medicine. Well, let me tell you how this trick works now. Okay, first, when they want to discount a risk that's been found by independent researchers, and you have to remember, independent researchers don't do these studies too long, often because they don't have the money to do them. The drug companies are usually the ones that do the studies, and they aren't telling anybody when there's adverse effects. So when adverse effects do come out, we're just plain lucky to know about them. But they don't get much headlines anyhow. So when I heard this in the background on CNN that there were hardly no birth defects, well, when I got to it, yeah, these 2 studies, let me tell you how scientific they are. They both consist of telephone interviews with women who had their kids, I don't know how long ago. You know, there's nothing scientific about them. I mean, I could go on forever, and I'm putting out 2 articles on it. But the point being that the major media, every one of them, published a headline about those studies. And in fact, today, I went online just to check this out because I'm writing this article. And there was another article that came out that said the CDC found that SSRIs are prescribed more often in the United States than any other drug, even blood pressure pills. So picture that. You know, this epidemic of depression that I guess I missed, it's the number 1 drug class in the United States. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Let's see how the media covered that. So I went and did a Google search of the birth defects, the CDC, and the CDC backed that birth defect study. That's what makes it really sick, to tie our money in with these studies and then use the government to say that, to justify them like they're real. Well, I put in CDC, antidepressants, birth defects. I brought up, to begin with, 200 and some articles yet today, and those studies were out the last month. Then I typed in CDC, most prescribed, and antidepressants. Came up with 5, and not even major news outlets. Now that is how much they're controlling this media, because they don't want to hear that more people are taking antidepressants than blood pressure medicine. I mean, people are going to start to think, well, that is bizarre. These are supposed to be for severe depression. Well, they don't want that study out, so it isn't out there. And so the people are not getting the real truth about these drugs, and more people are taking them, and it's not just one drug. They're mixing these drugs together in people.
And there's
First they'll give them the SSRIs, and then they'll say they come in and they're having a reaction to the SSRIs. But instead of saying it's the SSRI reaction, they put them on the antipsychotic.
Yeah, they'll say that you have a manic reaction to the SSRIs,
right.
And they say, oh, well, actually, you're bipolar now. Rather than saying it's a drug side effect, it's like, oh, you actually have bipolar. And then now boom, you're on another deeper drug, and then you're down the road to dependency and to the stigma and the labeling and the whole creation of yourself as a mental patients. Do you want to say something about the people may be shocked to learn that there's really, once the drugs are approved and on the market, there's very, very little monitoring of how it affects people. There's very little post-marketing studies and monitoring that are done.
Well, once in a while, the FDA will say that, because they're always drugs are put on the market approved on just small studies. So, I mean, it isn't representative of the real world. And they siphon out any people that might react and all this kind of stuff. So it doesn't represent the real world at all. So they'll tell the drug, okay, we're gonna approve it, but no, we want you to conduct these post-marketing studies. Well, I forget how many, but I can't keep up with all these statistics. But Congress or something, went about trying to find out how many of these studies have actually been done on drugs, and they don't do them at all. So no. Unless private researchers do something and find these links, the only way they ever come out is when all these people start getting sick. And that's what happened with Zyprexa. And I'll tell you what is the downfall of these drug companies, and the gift from God is that they got so greedy that they were ripping off Medicaid and Medicare so bad for these expensive drugs. Because now they want their money back. And they want their money back not only for the drugs they paid for that should have been prescribed, they want the money back for all the injured people.
And now several states are actually suing.
I think it's up to about 12. It's going there. And I think they're going to bankrupt them drug companies. And David Graham, the scientist at the FDA that blew the whistle on Vioxx and speaks out on Zyprexa and stuff, that's what he said this preemption is all about. Because the drug companies are backed into a corner, and they know there is so much massive litigation that they're going down. So that's when the administration come up with this bright idea for the FDA to grant preemption to all these drug companies.
What does that mean? What does that mean, preemption?
That's what I was describing before about them saying that, making that rule that if they approve the drug and approve the drug labeling, you can't sue them in court for a warning that wasn't on that label.
Ah, I see. That's a very twisted logic. It reminds
me. I know
me
it, and that's so good for them because people don't understand it.
It reminds me of how the nuclear power industry managed to get the government to pass a law saying that they couldn't be held financially responsible if there were accidents. To be honest.
Well, they're doing it in all the federal agencies. So all the major corporations, anything to do with cars, pesticides. What did you just say?
The nuclear power industry. This was years ago.
Sure.
I think it was called the Price-Anderson Act.
This is what they're doing in all the federal agencies. And so the state courts, the citizens, the laws that they have on the books to protect consumers, you can't sue under them. Okay? And I'll tell you where it's really showing up. There's a case in the Supreme Court right now. It's a case of one lone woman from Vermont that filed a drug company because they administered a drug to her wrong, and it caused her to have adverse reactions and ended up with her arm cut off, amputated. Well, she sued, saying that Wyeth should have put that on the warning label, that they shouldn't administer that drug that way because they knew about it. Well, the jury found in her favor. Wyeth appealed and all the way to the Vermont Supreme Court, and they affirmed the verdict. Now they're up in the United States Supreme Court, and it's accepted. And I went up there to look at what's going on, and they have a brief filed by an organization that represents about every major corporation in the United States, and they're all listed on there, on that brief. And I mean, it's just horrifying to me. Here's this one lone little gal, and here's these piling on. The FDA writes a brief on Wyatt's behalf too. And then I open up this brief, and I go down and I just see this list of every major corporation because they plan to use it in all the other cases when a car is defective or a toy is defective or whatever. If that regulatory agency did not say that they had to warn about that hazard, you're not going to be able to sue over it.
So it puts the responsibility on the regulatory agency, and the regulatory agency sort of gives them the green light, and they says, "Well, the regulatory agency gave us the green light." It's this whole circular.
That's exactly right.
Circular logic. Well, let me ask you a a question that maybe is kind of a devil's advocate question, because I think it relates to the whole issue of medical ethics. Because really, this is a question of like medical ethics and standards, and what are the standards for products? I mean, because you're talking about product safety. Because I think that what some people will say is that, well, okay, Zyprexa causes diabetes, Zyprexa causes pancreatitis, and it causes all these problems. But schizophrenia is so much worse that that's just part of the deal. That it's just so much better that people have these drugs, even if they are kind of dangerous, and if they do have these really bad adverse effects, because the psychosis itself and the mental illness and the mental disorders themselves are so bad that it's kind of worth it. What would be your response to that argument, knowing what you do about medical ethics and product safety and that kind of thing?
Well, I might agree with that if Zyprexa was prescribed only for what it's meant for. When somebody's in the psychotic stage of schizophrenia. I'm not trying to deny that there isn't some people out there that do get very, very mentally ill and might need these drugs. Or even if there isn't such a thing as bipolar disorder, and maybe they might need this drug in the manic phase of bipolar. But they don't need it for life, number one. But that drug is being prescribed to everyone for everything. It's only approved for those two things, but it's being prescribed for behavior disorders, attention deficit, autism. Like I said, if they get side effects from the SSRI, it's being prescribed with the SSRI then, saying that that's bipolar disorder then or something. And they're being sold in what's called off-label. And the thing is, the pharmaceutical company has gotten so powerful that it has infiltrated the whole medical profession, and it's got doctors in every field of medicine prescribing these psych drugs to kids. I mean, I think maybe your listeners might have heard of a little 4-year-old that just OD'd in Massachusetts in December. That's bringing this whole issue to a head.
Yeah,
because that
she had a
shrink
bipolar
that little girl.
She had a bipolar diagnosis at age 2, I think.
ADHD and bipolar disorder at 2.5.
Yeah.
Now they put that little girl.
How you can have both ADHD and bipolar at age 2.5 is just
the terrible
crazy.
twos have been around for how long? From the beginning of time. Nobody could diagnose, but she didn't even diagnose her. I mean, I've been following that case really steady, because it's bringing doctors that ordinarily wouldn't speak up against this mass drugging of people, but being it's kids and it's killing kids, they're doing it. But the more I investigate, this is going on now in all these residential treatment centers where teens go and are housed when they're act out or whatever, and they're being given these drug cocktails. And so it goes back to your question, that how I respond to this is that I never said maybe Zyprexa wasn't needed by a few people like it was supposed to be, and for a limited amount of time, though. But it is not meant for 2-year-old babies and old people in nursing homes, in the VA system, in state systems, and foster care, that they have, the drug companies have it being prescribed to everyone, and then mixing it in with these other drugs.
Yeah, the rates of foster care kids on these drugs is just enormous.
Isn't it unreal?
And it's really about control, because they are tranquilizers, and they often calm people, not always, but they often calm people down, and that's sort of like what they're being pushed and told is these kids need, and so they just start to just put them on multiple drugs. But I have to question. I mean, I think my sense of the way that the entire medical system is set up is that instead of looking at studies like nutrition studies, or studies like exercise studies, or all the different factors that go into what gets labeled and diagnosed as schizophrenia or bipolar, instead the whole medical system is set up to say, okay, we're going to go for these blockbuster drugs that treat the entire problem, regardless of whether it's the trauma of being a foster kid, or whether it's a spiritual problem that the person has, or whether it's poverty or nutrition. We're going to treat the entire problem like it's a brain chemistry problem, and then we're going to put all of our research money into neuroscience, and all of the entire product process, the product approval process, is going to be completely biased in favor of these magic bullet drugs that the pharmaceutical companies are selling, and then once you look at all of that, to then say, well, the diabetes is worth it, or the occasional suicide is worth it for it just doesn't make any sense at all, simply from a standpoint of what's the best way to respond to people who need help.
Well, and like I said, without the internet, this would never get out. They just go on killing people forever. Okay, the internet really, like if you were involved in the Zyprexa, and I knew you were, documents case, without the internet, that information, they would have been successful.
Yeah, well,
and you guys would have been shut up forever.
It makes me think of when the neuroleptics, when Thorazine and Mellaril and Haldol were introduced, patients were getting tardive dyskinesia for like 20, 30 years before it ever actually got acknowledged, before they said, oh, well, actually the drugs do cause tardive dyskinesia, which is a major brain neurological disorder that causes total neurological problems and involuntary facial tics and disfiguration and memory problems and cognitive problems. It took them like 30 years. So I really see what you're saying about the internet facilitating a much faster awareness in the public. The people who are victimized can find out about each other a lot faster.
Right, and like I say, the other downfall for them is their greed because of the Medicaid and Medicare system. All these people, all these kids in foster care and everything, and say, for instance, this family in Massachusetts, it was a mass production line. There was 5 people in that family, and that shrink had them all on this stuff. 2 other little kids, but they were all on Medicaid, okay? So all the services for the shrink and the drugs were paid for by Medicaid. And this is going on so rampant, they got so greedy that now Medicaid and Congress, like you said, committees are reeling in on it because they bankrupted the state Medicaid programs with especially these antipsychotics like Zyprexa.
Yeah, and it's just part of the whole pirate capitalism attitude of the Bush, and not to denigrate pirates, but it's this real, like, just they're basically like looting the society as much as they can. The girl's name was Rebecca Riley, I think.
Right.
So, Evelyn, I know you do so much research, and it's so valuable and insightful, and we were talking before, and I really appreciate the accuracy of what you're doing. You say that if you make a mistake, they're just going to jump on it. So you're very, very careful to get all your resources just down and absolutely airtight and solid. And I really commend you for that, because I think you're doing some of the best research on the pharmaceutical industry that's around these days. And I'm just wondering, what are some of the things that we've talked about a lot of things, but what are some of the other things that people may not know about that you think are really scandalous and really need to be brought into the public attention, that are just being covered up by the mainstream media at this point?
When you put it that way, the other thing that I just swung into last year, but I'm getting a real grasp of it now, is the medical device industry. The cardiacs and the defibrillators and the stents and the disc replacement surgeries. They're doing the same thing with that. They're implanting stents in people that don't need them, and defibrillators and cardiac and pacemakers and things, and they're hiding the defects until they start showing up in people, and they're doing the exact same thing with that. In fact, they're getting in trouble now finally for the exact same reason. They overbilled Medicaid and Medicare, and so it's showing up. And all the doctors are in on this. This is not a one-man show here with the drug companies pulling the reins on any of this. By now, and I document my work exactly how they get these doctors, but they're in on it, and so are the medical supply companies. I haven't watched Michael Moore's movie because it isn't here in Green Bay. I don't know why, but I could tell you that whole side of it too, with the insurance companies and hospitals. But right now, the medical device companies, God forbid, any patients that got one of those new drug-eluting stents put in, or one of those devices, the artificial disc that's supposed to be better than the spinal fusion because then your back can move. They were approved with hardly any studies, and now they're all causing problems, and they're not any better than the old ones. But the stents were called a medical record for how many sold in the first couple of years they were on the market. And for instance, to tell you how far behind they are on the media covering this stuff, my sister was down a few months ago. She was watching the morning show, and I was in the bathroom doing my hair or whatever. And she called me out here to show me that this thing about this drug-eluting stent and how she had got that a couple of years ago. And I said, Jerry, I reported on that last fall, I believe, and I went and looked it up, and it was in September. And this was like 6 months later. And they're acting like it's news. It's not news. They know it. They're not publishing it. So I hate to say it to your listeners who got these devices. Well, I really hate to say it because there's nothing they can do about them. Picture that. They can't take them out. Like the stents, the tissue grows over them. And the discs in the back, they migrate out of position. It's awful.
Well, hopefully one of the ways that it can be addressed is if money is put into actually creating ways to help people who have these devices implanted, because that's a really serious issue. And I know your work is so far-ranging, and it's really a problem with the medical system as a whole. What do you think is the kind of solution? I mean, you mentioned Michael Moore's film. I mean, do you think that we really need to go to a national health service like they have in Canada and Cuba and England to really kind of get at the heart of this?
Absolutely.
How would that
Sure.
look? I mean, why do you think that would be better?
Well, I've always thought that. When I can remember when I was 17 years old, and I'm 57 now, writing to Ted Kennedy about a national health care plan. Okay, so I've always been behind that. But now what I've seen happen with these major corporations and the hospitals and the medical benefits managers and the insurance companies and stuff, I'm convinced there is no way out of this but a major medical, one system. And of course they don't want it because the profits aren't going to be there for them. But you look at it, and the pharmaceutical company and the medical profession is the highest industries other than oil in the country. Well, of course, we've got war profiteering going on, so they're up there too now. But otherwise, these people are making outrageous money, and I just read where half the bankruptcies now in this country are because of medical bills, because the Republican Congress said you can't file medical bills under bankruptcy no more. So people are losing their homes and everything, and like these drugs. I mean, a prescription for one of these, like Zyprexa, is even yet, I think, like close to $400 a month. Now, this is the kind of money they've been draining out of us taxpayers for these drugs. And now we've got the injuries to deal with. I don't see how we're going to stop it without having one party, with one party paying the bill. I mean, I think anybody.
The politics and the money are so powerful. I mean, because under Clinton, there was an attempt at healthcare reform, and it just became a complete political fiasco, basically because the Democratic Party is in the pockets of the corporations as well. But it seems like this is just such a deep issue that the two parties don't really have much of a solution on the horizon, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. But are you hopeful for any kind of change, or do you just see this being rampant and just continuing to deteriorate? Or
well, I'll tell you, if things keep going for these pharmaceutical companies like they're going, we might see a change there, whether they like it or not, a big change. Because what's happened is, maybe you followed this. After the big Zyprexa scandal was published in the media, in April, in 9 days, 4 shareholder suits were filed against Lilly for its fraud involving Zyprexa. Now, shareholder suits like the Medicaid fraud suits aren't covered by insurance. And they're saying that just those days that the New York Times ran that story, they lost $3.5 billion, the shareholders. And they say overall, they lost, I think it was either $30 or $50 billion. And they want that back from the company and the executives. Now, those shareholders' lawsuits in the Medicaid are fraud, so they can't be covered by insurance. So these little piddly-ass suits that they dismissed with $1.6 billion for 28,000, those are nothing They don't even care about those. But they have been hit with the worst nightmare now because of that. Well, the shareholders are saying they first learned that for the first time when it came out in the Times from the leaked documents, that Lilly knew this. And they're the ones accusing their own company, and they're the owners, saying you committed fraud with Zyprexa since 1996.
Because they lost,
So,
they ended up losing money at the end of it. As soon as they
well, yeah,
started
because
losing money, that's when they got angry and
well,
launched
see
the
what they did.
suits.
They list in the lawsuits where because they promoted it off label and everything illegally, they boosted the profit so much. But then when the truth came out, they crashed. And so now anybody that bought stock when they seen that profit so high got ripped off because they were committing fraud. And that was a misrepresentation of the future profits from Zyprexa. So, and other drug companies are under the same thing, and they're going at them with the medical devices too. So I'm hoping that if the media would start printing the truth and letting people know about this stuff, that more people would get outraged and they would be contacting their senators and congressmen and telling them to shut this down, what these medical profession is doing. Because they're all tied into it now.
It seems like there's a real parallel with the tobacco industry. Is that right?
It is. It is. That's what and many people. I'm a smoker, and I know that's horrible, and that's probably why I never followed the tobacco industry thing much. But that's what I see it compared to, and I guess it is. But then, didn't the Bush administration just really cut down on what the government was supposed to win on from the tobacco industry too?
Yeah, they really backed off. There was a moment when they were going after the industry, but they've really backed off in the last 18 months or so.
Right. So it's big business, okay? And what your listeners need to learn from all this, what's happened since Bush took office, and I hope all Americans will learn, that this government in this country was never meant to be set up where one political party ran the whole show, because things like this would happen, okay? So when the Democrats at least took back control of Congress last November, things started turning over for the drug companies and the medical profession. Because before that, they could investigate all these things, but they couldn't do anything about it even when they found out that they were right about what they suspected, because the Republicans were in the majority and they wouldn't allow them to bring it to the floor of Congress. Well, now they are. And if Americans learn one thing, and I don't care which party, it is not healthy to allow any one party to control this whole government. Because whoever they're in favor of or what policies, that's what the rest of us are going to have to go by. I have to put in this funny one. I did think, I can't stand Dick Cheney. Well, I had to laugh picturing that he probably got one of these heart stents. You know, and I thought, well, how do you feel, Mr. Cheney, now that you learn what your drug company did to you?
Yeah, he might even own stock in the company that.
Oh, probably.
Yeah, but the thing that's not funny is that if he starts to have any problems with it, he's the one who can afford the operation that's going to help him out, whereas somebody else isn't going to be able to afford it.
Exactly. And like my sister now, I didn't even know she had one of them. I knew that she had that angioplasty but a few years ago, but I never knew anything about that, okay? It's only when I got assignments to investigate these devices that I ever learned about this. And so I had to sit, she's like, well, what can I do then? Because you might develop clots. So you got to live with this the rest of your life. There might be blood clots that will develop because of them stents and give you a heart attack or stroke at any minute. So I told her, Jer, I'm sorry. There's nothing you can't do. And she said, well, I didn't even know it was being put in until after I got out of surgery and they told me.
Yeah.
And I said, well, that's the way it works.
Yeah. Are you hopeful at all, just the way in which people are more interested in holistic and alternative health and are taking a little bit more charge of their health care and becoming more knowledgeable in general in this country?
Geez, you know, I don't know. The problem here is that it would be bad enough, like, say, for like the psych drugs, if it was just the shrinks prescribing them. But they got these general practitioners and stuff that know nothing about psychiatry, the illnesses or the side effects, handing them out to the people, you know, the patients. Maybe they've been their doctor for years that they'd never suspect. And then once they have the side effects, they never suspect it because they'd never think the good doctor who they love, who's treated them so good, gave them something that would harm them. And so unless the media starts really putting this stuff out there, I don't think it's going to get through to the people.
Well, that's a
I mean,
pessimistic.
look, you were involved in the Zyprexa thing.
Yes.
I don't know if you ever looked around to see how widespread people heard about this, but they didn't hear about it.
It was just sort of a New York Times thing, and I know that the folks that I work with and am in touch with certainly were aware of it, but it really flared up quickly and then died down. And, given the amount of information that came out and the magnitude of the scandal, you're absolutely right. The mainstream media didn't pick it up and run with it. And I think that it was because of there was this chilling effect. They were afraid of how they were going to get Eli Lilly lawyers coming after them if they followed up on it.
No, that's not it. That's not it at all. I'll tell you what it is. The media has slowly, since they got allowed to advertise on TV, they didn't do this overnight. Slowly, they kept feeding the major media outlets more and more money for ads until, slowly, like I said, until it got to the point that now those major media corporations are dependent on those as ad dollars. And their budgets are dependent on it. So if something bad comes out about a drug like Zyprexa there, they've got to print it some, okay? I mean, especially like the New York Times, if it's hand-fed that story, it would look pretty bad if somebody else ran with it. But if you notice, none of the other major media broadcast that story like they do any other, like they did those birth defect studies, and that's why, because they're all dependent on that. And I've been sitting watching more about the last 2 months about all the different ads that are on TV, and I see exactly how they did it. I mean, I've been in the media. I worked for Dayton Daily News for years. And so, I mean, I know about ad dollars and how it controls, but this is completely out of hand.
Yeah, the media have really become the public relations arm of corporate America in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Well,
and
listen,
I had the ability to keep this Zyprexa issue alive because Internet Daily will publish my work, and all over the world, and they're picked up in the headlines.
And I really encourage people to read more of your work. I'm sorry to cut you off. There's so much to talk about, and we are out of time. But Evelyn Pringle, I really want to really thank you for joining us today on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
You've been listening to an interview with Evelyn Pringle. She's a journalist who writes on pharmaceutical company corruption for op-ed news and also a number of different internet outlets. And that's about all the time we have this week. Thanks a lot for joining us on Madness Radio. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.